The White House faces an ever-growing list of scandals. The FBI's former director says Donald Trump is morally unfit to be president. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the controversies surrounding the Oval Office. These days, critics of Donald Trump see the White House more like a house of cards. The foundations of the Oval Office were given a good shake by a blockbuster interview with former FBI Director James Comey, who called Trump a serial liar who treats women like meat. Trump also had to fight off criticism from his own base, as well as face a series of scandals. Some of his staunchest allies in the media came out against his decision to bomb Syria. On top of all this are suspicions of campaign finance and mail fraud, a secret love child, and apparent attempts to undercut a special prosecutor who's dogged the Oval Office. Now, it all has us asking, how can the president govern under the weight of so many controversies? Well, Sandra Gatman begins the conversation with this report.
A new tell-all about Donald J. Trump is hitting the shelves, and critics of the U.S. president hope it might provide new fodder to use against him. The author is former FBI Director James Comey, who Trump fired last year. In a promotional interview, James Comey described Trump as morally unfit.
A person who sees moral equivalence in Charlottesville, who talks about and treats women like they're pieces of meat, who lies constantly about matters big and small and insists the American people believe it, that person's not fit to be president of the United States on moral grounds.
Trump and his supporters have dismissed Comey's accusations, saying he's on a mission to sell books.
He's taking 1 or 2 or 3 meetings with the president and retroactively putting his own spin on them to sell books. It seems to me like he sounds like a disgruntled ex-employee.
But it's not the first book to question Trump's competence. In Michael Wolff's Fire and Fury, the president's closest aides painted a damning portrait of the president's erratic behavior and general ignorance. Of course, Trump has long dismissed accusations about his mental fitness as slander, describing himself on Twitter as like really smart and a very stable genius at that. But it's also on Twitter where Trump's critics say the president openly displays his instability, as well as his greatest weakness, a fondness for cable TV and Fox News.
Fox and Friends talked about the NFL protests. 3 minutes later, Trump tweeted about the NFL protests. Fox and Friends criticized Democrats over immigration. Trump tweeted about Democrats and immigration.
What's more, Trump's friends at Fox know the president is watching.
The president needs to meet this challenge and not just carry on the way the Obama administration did.
You're seeing these Fox hosts push forward messages they want the White House to hold on to grab hold of and to ride.
It's no secret that Trump has personal ties to Fox News personalities. But new revelations that Fox's star host Sean Hannity shares Trump's personal lawyer Michael Cohen are the clearest sign yet. And it's that very question of who holds sway over Trump that has critics questioning his fitness to govern.
Thank you very
Comey, for one, hasn't dismissed reports Russia might have something it can use against the president.
There's a non-zero possibility that the Russians have some sway over him that is rooted in his personal experience. And I don't know whether that's the business about the activity in a Moscow hotel room or finances or something else.
Once again, talk of impeachment is on the lips of many in the media, as Trump battles investigations into possible collusion with Russia and Russian meddling in the 2016 election, as well as hush money allegedly paid to adult film star Stormy Daniels, who says she had a sexual encounter with the president shortly after he married Melania.
To making sure that everyone finds out the truth.
But as Trump argues, is the media storm looking increasingly desperate? Or could these scandals piling up against Trump strengthen the case for his impeachment? Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Minneapolis is Richard Painter. He is the former White House Chief Ethics Counsel under President George W. Bush. In Valley View, Texas, we have conservative radio talk show host John Gibson. And completing our panel from Washington, D.C., former federal prosecutor Robert Thomas. Thanks, all three of you, for joining us. Let me begin in Minneapolis. Richard, it almost feels like there are just too many scandals and/or controversies to really list at this point. So you tell me, where should the public's attention be focused rightly right now? What really says this president is worthy of office or he isn't?
Well, this is the most scandal-plagued administration I think we've ever had in American history. But the public needs to focus on the issues that pose the most immediate threat to the public interest. We have a president who behaves at times as if he's psychologically imbalanced. You look at his Twitter feed, it's very disturbing that he's in control of nuclear weapons. Second, he has connections with foreign governments and oligarchs all over the world, financial ties that have not fully been disclosed, some of which are in violation of the United States Constitution's Emoluments Clause. This is a threat that the founders foresaw when they drafted the Constitution. Third, we do have an ongoing pattern of obstruction of justice, an attempt to derail the Russia investigation, and attacks on the federal prosecutors, on the FBI, verbal attacks on the federal courts, and attempts to fire the special prosecutor. That is of great concern to anybody who values the rule of law in our country.
Okay, John Gibson, I mean, critics of Trump have long said that his mental state was an issue, but he was voted in anyway. Do you think the public should genuinely be worried about the White House at this point, or are all these scandals and controversies just detracting from the fact that maybe he is a good president?
Look, this morning the Koreas announced that they're ending the 68-year war. North Korea, Kim Jong-un, and South Korea. There are two Americas, one that supports Donald Trump and one that's represented by Richard Painter. He's running for Senate in Minnesota. It's a very liberal state. The things he says about Trump are very, very popular on the liberal side of this country. But I don't think the people who voted for Donald Trump are at all concerned about what Richard Painter objects to.
Okay, Robert Thomas, do you think this is a president worthy of office at this point?
No, but in fairness, I didn't think he was worthy of office before the election. I think there were a fair number of people in the United States who were very uneasy about Mr. Trump, but hoped that he would act more presidential once in office. That has turned out to be unwise thinking, as to expect a 71-year-old man to suddenly change his behavior and to change his character has not met expectations, let's say. So anyone who is surprised by his conduct in office and the number of scandals that have followed him really has not paid deep attention to the way he's lived his life as a businessman. You know, he had a reputation among his voting base as a savvy businessman, but if you dig into those details, savvy is not the right word to put on that record.
Okay, John, let me go back to you. I mean, the chief concern here, though, is rightly or wrongly, the scandals and controversies that are plaguing the White House are actually crippling his ability to govern. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't think it's true at all. I mean, look at the market, look at the economy. I mean, there's a story in the New York Times this morning about a 17-year-old working in an airplane factory who's never worked in fast food because there's an actual shortage of labor and jobs are booming. I don't think the American public is upset with Donald Trump. I think his opponents are upset with him, and they like to count up these so-called scandals against him like they're counting coup. I'm not surprised that your other two guests don't like Donald Trump. I think it goes without saying. I think they've got lots of objections to him. It's fine for them to have him. If Mr. Painter can get elected to the Senate in Minnesota by attacking Donald Trump, good for him. But I don't think that represents the country at large, and to say so misrepresents reality, I think.
Okay, Richard Painter, if...
Let me say something here.
Go ahead.
I have a right to respond to that. And the vast majority of people who voted for Donald Trump in the general election are good people. They're not people who listen to right-wing talk show hosts on the radio, people like Sean Hannity. and Mr. Gibson. They don't listen to that garbage. They don't listen to the right-wing stuff on Breitbart News. That's a minority of people. They're the people who may have helped Donald Trump get the Republican nomination. But the majority of people voted for Donald Trump, wanted change in America. They were right to want change in America. But Donald Trump is not bringing us the change we need. We don't need billionaires taking over our government. We don't need people who are vassals for Vladimir Putin running the White House and trying to obstruct justice. That's not what the American people voted for. So don't confuse the majority of Americans who may have voted, actually a minority because he didn't win the popular vote, but the Americans who voted for Donald Trump in the election were the nut jobs who listen to you on the radio. Nobody wants to hear you anymore. No one wants to hear Breitbart News or Sean Hannity or Sean Hannity. We don't. Well, I don't know whether Michael Cohen is your lawyer too. I don't know what's going on here.
No, Michael Cohen. I don't know Michael
to your garbage
Cohen.
On the radio.
I know you are running for a Democratic seat in a liberal state, and you're going to go all anti-Trump, and it's probably going to work for you. But don't misrepresent the country.
Let me ask Robert.
But the majority of the country does not support people like you and the alt-right and the nut jobs on right-wing talk radio, even if they voted for Donald Trump.
Okay.
We don't need people like you. We just don't in America. We want a democracy.
Oh, we don't? Okay, so now you're ejecting me from the country? Good, Richard. I'll tell you what. You're going to make
not. You have every First Amendment right to be here. You and the KKK and the rest of them. Fine.
But don't think that you are representing the country. You are representing a very liberal state that hates Trump, always hates Trump, is always going to hate Trump, and it's just not going to make any difference.
If we can, gentlemen, let's get back to what's at the heart of the debate that we're having here on this program. And Robert, let me ask you, one of the issues that many Americans complain about now is that an entirely new set of moral standards has now been established because of this president, now for better or for worse. When we look back, for example, at the fact that a president who had a consensual extramarital relationship with an adult but said he didn't was eventually impeached for having said he didn't under oath in front of Congress. Yet 20 years later, we now have a president that can be heard on tape saying he can grab women's genitals because he's rich. He can refuse to hand over his tax returns, for example. Do you think an entirely new set of moral standards has now come into practice because of this president?
Certainly during this presidency, we are dealing with a different set of standards. This president has shown an alarming disregard for the political norms of the country. And that's really important because I don't think it necessarily means that we are going to stay in this place. But in terms of where we are right now, there are many political and cultural values and norms in this country that are under attack. And I hope that it does not carry on past this presidency, but I think we are at risk of that. And, you know, our Constitution is revered in the United States, but there's a misconception in our country that the Constitution is somehow magically going to save us. The Constitution is a piece of paper. It only works if the political norms operating in the country agree to abide by it. And as we see more and more of these norms eroding, we are at risk of the Constitution and the rule of law going down with it. And, you know, I don't want to be partisan here, and I don't want to be engaged in the kind of back and forth that we just had a few minutes ago. But as a genuinely concerned citizen and as a former law enforcement officer, I'm critical of Democrats and Republicans at various different times. I'm very concerned about what I see the president doing, saying on Twitter, what he says about law enforcement officers, what he says about judges. This is not appropriate. It's not presidential.
Okay, John, let me ask you. I mean, these are facts. You know what, for example, Trump said about grabbing women. He can say it was locker room talk and he was egged on and into it. But that is what he said. And it really does change the moral standard of the presidential office. Does that concern you?
No, it doesn't. I mean, explain to me John Kennedy. I don't hear liberals suddenly attacking the memory of John Kennedy or changing JFK airport name because we now know of how he behaved in the White House, not before the White House, but in the White House. Look, everybody's saying, okay, we have these examples of Trump saying things that Richard wouldn't say, your other guests wouldn't say, I wouldn't say. Nonetheless, people knew about that when they voted for him, and they are satisfied with his performance. And I think of this stuff of violating political norms, which I'm hearing from one of your guests, and I'm hearing from James Comey, I'm hearing from Richard Painter. It's like parking tickets, handing out tickets for violating political norms. People wanted this guy. I understand the other two guests didn't. I'm sorry they're disappointed, but this is what they've got. And they ought to look at the record of what is actually happening in his presidency rather than digging up violations of political norms.
Okay, Richard Painter, are we changing political norms or eroding basic morals?
This isn't about political norms, it's basically decency. It's basic decency. Sexual assault is not a question of political norms. It is something we should not tolerate in our country. Collusion with the Russians to undermine our democratic system is not something we should tolerate in our country. We have a respectable two-party system, and we have lots of solid conservatives who read respectable publications like the Wall Street Journal, who don't listen to the garbage on right-wing talk radio, who don't listen to Sean Hannity, who shares a lawyer with Donald Trump. We have respectable conservatives who are becoming disgusted with this administration and disgusted with its apologists. And they're destroying the Republican Party. And this is a tragedy for our country, as well as for the Republican Party, that people keep on shilling for a president who is clearly in violation of the law, is obstructing justice, and appears to be mentally unstable. Just look at his Twitter feed and ask yourself, is this a stable man, someone you would trust with nuclear weapons? The answer is no.
Okay. John, let me ask you, I mean, we're having this debate off the back of the release of James Comey's new book. Many people have been saying that this is it. This expose is the most damaging to the president by far. But actually, we saw, Michael Wolff write something similar with very top sources at the White House, according to him, in Fire and Fury. And that arguably left the president no worse off. So what do you make of Comey's book? Will this change anything for this administration?
Look, let's get something straight about Comey's book. It's not my opinion, but opinion of people at the major networks and at the major newspapers. There's nothing new in this book except James Comey's impressions, personal impressions about Donald Trump, and James Comey's opinions about how Donald Trump is violating legal and political norms, as your other two guests have talked about. This is James Comey setting himself up to be the holiest of holier than thous, condemning the president, going to political war with him, and he should expect tweets firing back at him. And the fact that he thinks he ought to be able to attack the president without being attacked himself tells you what kind of fragile figure he is. Look, this is a political, Comey said it himself. He doesn't want Trump impeached. He wants him defeated in the next election. That's what this is all about. It's what Mr. Painter is all about. It's about Comey's all about, and it's what most of the attacks on Trump from the left are all about.
Okay, I mean, that is, you bring up something.
That's not right. This is about our country and our democracy.
You bring up something.
That's what it's about, our country and our democracy. And Robert Mueller is the one who's going to take care of this, not Comey.
How is he undermining democracy?
Is that a serious question?
President Trump is continuing to obstruct justice, trying to fire the special prosecutor after he fired James Comey. Yes, he is. And he has allowed his campaign colluded with the Russians to subvert our election, and they are trying to throw out the special prosecutor. There are Republicans in this Justice Department he's attacking. Rod Rosenstein, Jeff Sessions. Yes, it was subverted by Vladimir Putin. We know that.
That still hasn't been proven.
We know that. We're not stupid that Vladimir Putin interfered in our election.
Vladimir Putin, you are making an unfounded charge.
I'll tell you what, we're down to our last minute. Robert Thomas, you've been waiting to get in there.
Interfered in the American election. Wow.
Yeah, interfered is different than subverted. You use the word subverted. There's no proof the election was subverted.
Well, you can explain to your right-wing listeners the difference between interfere and subvert.
For political purposes. You ought to be ashamed.
Okay, I'll tell you what. We're down to our last minute here, and I would wanted Robert Thomas to get his final words in.
I'm not ashamed.
Robert Thomas,
President
go ahead.
Trump ought to be ashamed of associating with Vladimir Putin and his cronies.
Okay, Richard Painter, that collusion is yet to be proven. Unfortunately for your campaign there. But go ahead, Robert Thomas. Let me get some final words from you.
There's no debate that Russia interfered with the election and attacked our country. The only question is and what is being investigated is the extent to which the Trump campaign coordinated with that. There's already quite a lot of evidence based on the indictments that we've seen and the convictions that we've seen that the campaign was happy to receive this assistance from Russia. The issue of whether President Trump was involved is what remains to be determined. But when people say we should not be using the term collusion, that's sort of a term of art that's just gotten going on the media. The real issue is conspiracy. Was there a criminal conspiracy to coordinate with the Russians? But there's zero ambiguity that the Russians attempted to and did attack our democracy successfully in disturbing the election process.
But unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap up this debate for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. Still to come, Iraq debates whether the Kurdish regional government can control its oil exports. What will the decision mean for the region's economy? And we ask whether Facebook's doing enough to combat hate speech in Myanmar. Next month, a court in Baghdad will decide whether the Kurdish regional government can continue to control its oil fields. The decision could be a game changer, as Iraq's government argues the KRG has no right to independently export oil. Baghdad and Erbil have been at each other's throats since the KRG held an independence referendum last year. And if the court sides with the federal government, the KRG would lose control of almost all its incoming revenue. Shoaib Hassan reports.
It began as so many other disputes in the Middle East, as a disagreement over oil. But this one between the Kurdish autonomous region in northern Iraq and the Iraqi government has now deteriorated into full-on a socio-economic crisis.
For the last 4 years, the KRG government has been unable to pay the salary and the wages of the government employees, especially the teachers and the health services, for paying a quarter of the salary and wage every sort of 3-4 months.
Oil revenues had been shared by the Kurdish regional government and Baghdad under an agreement that gave the region autonomy. But the KRG says Iraqi authorities have refused to pay their share since 2014. Iraq says the payments were stopped after the KRG violated the agreement and started exporting oil independently through a pipeline to Turkey. The matter is currently being adjudicated in Iraq's Supreme Court. It's set to begin hearings in May, but the dispute has been complicated by last year's Kurdish referendum in favor of independence. The vote enraged Iraq, as well as neighbors Iran and Turkey, which both support the regional government but strongly oppose independence. International backing for Baghdad was instrumental when Iraqi forces moved to capture the region's main oil fields in Kirkuk. That shut off the KRG's main source of revenue. Baghdad has also restricted air access to the landlocked region. It's led to an economic crisis in the region and put immense pressure on the local government. But the KRG has refused to back down, and especially as international oil companies queue up to tap its estimated potential of 45 billion barrels. So, Will the KRG be able to win its case in court? And is the cost of going it alone worth the risk for its autonomy? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Bilal Wahab. He is a fellow at the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. From London, we have Iraqi affairs analyst and legal consultant Salah Hashimi. And also from Washington is Douglas Ollivant, Senior Vice President of the strategic consulting firm Mantid International. Thanks all so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Douglas, let me begin with you. There are really so many issues at play here, and not least what is actually legal under the Iraqi Constitution. And you believe it's precisely the Constitution that's both the cause of and arguably the solution to this dispute.
Sure. I think there are, let's stipulate the Iraqi Constitution is really poorly defined. There are many terms in it that are not defined, and there are clauses that contradict. I think there are three that are really relevant to this discussion. There's a clause in the Peace on Regions that says that the regions and the federal government must jointly administer existing fields. Existing fields are not defined, and what is a field that is not currently existing is also not defined. But at least by implication, there are maybe fields that could be administered by the regions alone. So this is the clause that most favors the KRG's interpretation. But then there are two other clauses in the Constitution. There's one that quite explicitly says that all of Iraq's natural resources, particularly the oil, belong to all Iraqis, which implies it belongs not to just the people who live on top of it, but all 18 provinces of Iraq. And then there's another clause that states that the federal government has responsibility for sovereign economic policy, and presumably international pipelines and things of this nature would fall under that clause. So I think in the regions, there's some language that favors the KRG interpretation, but elsewhere there are two clauses that favor federal Baghdad's interpretation, and it's really a constitutional muddle.
Okay, Bilal, let me ask you, does this come down to what is essentially a somewhat vaguely written series of constitutional articles that have allowed for this controversy over the KRG and its control of the oil fields to develop?
I agree with what Doug said, but let me add two other principles that the Constitution also enshrines. And one of them is oil federalism, that the central government doesn't have exclusive authority over the management and production of oil, and gives quite some leeway to not only the Kurdistan region, but any other province that may engage in exploration and production. That's one. The other principle is the principle of revenue sharing. The Constitution has two words that need to be explained. One of them is the word with, so the federal government with the provinces and the regional government, and then there is another word which is together. Now, obviously, this is very vague, and Iraq needs legislation to delineate the rights and responsibilities of the federal government vis-a-vis the regions, and such a law does not exist, and therefore both the Iraqi government and the KRG have taken matters into their own hands, into their own interpretations that favor them based on balance of power rather than rule of law.
Okay, Salah, let me ask you. Some are saying that the Kurdish regional government is arguably, the best run administration in Iraq. Some say it's safer and less corrupt and therefore more prosperous. And if it loses that autonomy via losing control over its resources, it will actually move the region backwards. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think, let me just comment first on what my two colleagues have just said. I think the absence of a clearly defined law governing the oil and gas in Iraq has created a major legal vacuum for both the Iraqi federal government and the Kurdish regional government. Now, it is absolutely correct that the Kurdish regional government is the most stable part of Iraq. However, I think Iraq is coming into fruition. I think the other parts of Iraq are becoming far more stable than they used to be. You're right in saying that the Constitution was basically the flag point as to the entire conflict and the underlying causes of it. I think it's fair to say that the constitution was drafted under circumstances that were not clearly favorable to the federal government of Iraq. It was drafted in circumstances whereby the country was unstable and clearly under occupation. And therefore, anything that would have been construed as favorable might not be after a number of years. Now, to say that to dispute any of the oil contracts made with international oil companies with the Kurdistan regional government will set the entire region of Iraq backwards, I think is a misstatement. Because what we need is a proper regulation, a proper administration of these contracts between federal Iraq and these oil companies. And let us not forget that the dispute between the federal government and the regional government not only lies with the signature of these contracts, it's actually the types of contracts. The types of contracts that the Iraqi government are offering are quite significantly different from those that the Kurdish regional government is offering. And that is creating an imbalance within the region itself. I think that also needs to be considered as part of the entire issue.
Bilal, let me just ask you then point blank, what would be a fair decision, in your opinion, for the court to make?
The court is actually in a tough spot because it will be interpreting the Constitution, but the Constitution itself is vague, sometimes described as aspirational. The precursor to a court ruling I would propose would be the challenge for the next parliament to actually pass the National Hydrocarbons Law. There was a draft in 2007 that both KRG and Baghdad agreed on, except for some minor glitches that ended up undermining the passage of that law, and then there were new versions in 2011. So right now, where Kurdistan's independence, at least economic independence, is not moving forward, and there is reintegration, economic and energy reintegration between KRG and Baghdad, it's time for the upcoming Iraqi parliament, we have elections on May 12, to actually pass that National Hydrocarbons Law. This ruling that's in front of the Supreme Court right now, the Constitutional Court, might actually create facts on the ground in favor of Baghdad and therefore undermine the passage of the national oil law, because the KRG is in an economic, political, and security weak position, and a ruling that is deemed to favor Baghdad, because indeed in the realm of oil exports and commercialization of Iraq's hydrocarbon resources, the Constitution does favor Baghdad. So, in fact, the KRG is slated to lose, but that will undermine the passage of the national oil law, which is going to set Iraq and KRG energy relations on a rule of law basis, based on institutions rather than political bickering.
But Bilal, while you say the KRG is in a politically weak position right now, I mean, proponents of the Kurdistan regional government, or the Kurdish regional government, say that is because they are being unfairly punished by the government in Baghdad. And Douglas, let me point this to you. They're saying they're being unfairly punished because they wanted the independence that they were supposed to get. Though it wasn't guaranteed through this vaguely written constitution, this was supposed to be an option for them. Is there some legitimacy to that complaint, that they are being targeted by Baghdad because they have only gone forward with what they were supposed to have when Iraq was liberated, if we can use that word, from Saddam Hussein?
I don't think that's a fair interpretation. I think that certainly what has happened in the wake of the reoccupation of Kirkuk, the bringing of Kirkuk and the other disputed territories under federal control, has been a redefinition of what the federal arrangements between Baghdad and the KRG are. As we've all noted here, I don't think there's any disagreement between any of us. The Constitution is extremely vague. And therefore, while the old arrangements in which the KRG had much more autonomy were clearly constitutional, the new arrangements are equally constitutional. So I think that's where we are with Baghdad redefining the terms in the wake of its recovery from ISIS. Now, just to clarify an earlier point on the relative transparency of Baghdad and Erbil, I think actually the opposite of what you said is the case. The oil situation in the north is remarkably obscured. We really have no idea how much oil the KRG produces, what they sell it for, what are their expenses. That's all very, very vague, very hazy. Whereas, thanks to the occupation, one of the virtues of Iraq's oil sector having been administered by the Americans is there's remarkable transparency. We know how much oil is produced, we know what it's sold for, we can track it as it leaves Iraq. Now, there are obviously lots of other problems in Baghdad, but oil transparency is a virtue in the south that really needs to be applied in the north.
Okay. Salah, let me ask you, there is, of course, the argument that if the KRG is allowed to sell its oil independently, it will only give further impetus to the independence movement in the region. What do you make of that argument?
Well, I think I would certainly agree with that, because certainly before the Iraqi army moved into Kirkuk and pushed the Kurdish security forces, or the Peshmerga, out of it at that time, Kirkuk was a great, huge, big incentive for the Kurdish regional government to declare independence because of its oil wealth. I think to say that Iraq's oil, as my colleague in America was saying, being correctly administrated and very transparent, I think that is somewhat of an understatement, because we do know of plenty of undeclared profit being made out of Iraq, not in the accounts of the government, but otherwise there are certain factions who have capitalized on the oil production that has not been declared by government books. So that certainly needs to be known. Now, in other terms, I think the conflict between the constitution, the Iraqi constitution, and that of the Kurdish administrative government will be dealt with in this court. But I think what's interesting is the court's declaration that the Prime Minister of Iraq himself, the Finance Minister of Iraq himself, and the Kurdish Prime Minister himself as being named as claimants or defendants in this case. Now, the reason why the court has declared that is because it sought that the case, first of all, had a political, constitutional, and financial perspective. That is somewhat unheard of in Iraq's modern legal history. But I think I would await to see the judgment. But let us not forget, I think the court will be mindful of the contracts that have been signed and the companies that have accepted these contracts. Let us not forget that before signing these contracts, these oil companies carry out a very thorough due diligence procedure whereby they would be very cautious about entering into any financial or contractual obligations before they are almost certain that these obligations and any commitments will be met in the future. Okay. So let's just wait and see.
Salah Hashmi, I will have to give you the final word because unfortunately we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my guests so much for joining us.
We know that the ultra-nationalist Buddhists have their own Facebooks and really inciting a lot of violence and a lot of hatred against the Rohingya or other ethnic minorities. And I'm afraid that Facebook has now turned into a beast than what it was originally intended to be used.
Well, Mark Zuckerberg says he created Facebook to bring people together. But in Myanmar, human rights activists say the platform is being used to spread hate speech. Zuckerberg told the U.S. Congress that his company needs to do more. He made the admission after UN investigators said the social media giant played a determining role in spreading anti-Rohingya propaganda. Well, earlier, my colleague Imran Garda discussed the controversy with our panel.
Well, joining me now from London is Chaw Win. He's the founder and executive director of the Burma Human Rights Network. In Washington, D.C., we have Hans von Spakovsky. He's a former member of the U.S. Federal Election Commission and co-author of Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk. And from Singapore, Benjamin Ang. He's a senior fellow at the Center of Excellence for National Security at RSIS Singapore. I thank you all for joining us. Cho Win, let me ask you directly. Is Facebook encouraging genocide?
I will not agree with this directly encouraging, but it has been a tool for the perpetrators to use to spread hate speech and to use very effectively. And one of the weakness from the Facebook side in order to failure to tackle down and to stop this kind of hate speech, it's also contributing in this hate crimes and also genocide in Burma.
Okay.
But I will not agree directly,
Certainly.
blaming on the Facebook on this way. Yeah.
Okay, so Benjamin Ang, Facebook's good at flagging porn. Sometimes it mistakes, I don't know, sculptures for pornography and things, right? It has thousands of people working for it. It flags a lot of things that it deems offensive and so forth. But when it comes to fake news, whether it's on people's feeds or as mass direct messages and so forth, we've heard from the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Myanmar that Facebook has turned into a beast and not what it originally intended. Does Facebook bear some responsibility for what has gone on with the Rohingya people, Benjamin?
Right now, it doesn't look like a legal responsibility, but many people would say an ethical or moral responsibility because of the sheer reach and power of its ability to communicate. It has a monopoly on people's attention, and therefore some responsibility must be had for the information which is being spread on it.
Hans, ethical, moral responsibility, has Facebook failed?
Well, no. I think we should keep in mind that the problem with setting up Facebook as a censor is that it's one thing for them to stop messages that incite violence, and I certainly agree they should do that. But when it comes to people expressing their opinions, even if we find it very distasteful, the problem with that is you then put them in the position of making decisions that have political consequences. And I would remind you that we had a question yesterday. As you know, the head of Facebook is testifying before the U.S. Congress. And one of the senators yesterday asked him about the fact that Facebook has censored the content of conservative web pages and conservative content, including 24 Catholic organizations, but they have never done that to sites that have liberal points of view. And that's the problem with giving Facebook the power to censor political content on their sites.
Yeah, so Cho, do you accept that? It's a free speech platform. It's a social media network. On top of all of that, they don't have many experts in the Burmese language, for example. So yes, fake things might proliferate on Facebook, but is it Facebook's job to keep up with it?
Let me elaborate here, explain something, because my organization has been working on monitoring on including Facebook. There are many ways we are monitoring on hate speech in Burma. So what Facebook is one of, social media is one of the things we are focusing on. And on Facebook, there are so many failure from the Facebook side, which is, they don't have enough people on the people to tackle down all those kind of hate speech, and also the lack of language expertise. And also there is another problem as the government influence. During 2010 and 2010 to 2015, our experience is those who are reporting to the hate speech account has been blocked. So that's very funny, very shocking, Those who are spreading hate speech, their account never happened anything. So, and also after the 2015, this position little bit changed. And those who are, the position is the majority complaining about reporting on one post. The decision is made depend on the number of number of reports.
Understood.
So it is also lack of the knowledge that what is the content is talking about. Sometimes when you are talking about the peaceful things, but those hate mongers are complaining and reporting, then your account has been blocked. So that's happened a lot. So Facebook need to employ enough people, those who understand the gravity of the situation in Burma, not only inside Burma. I think outside Burma also is very important, because inside Burma there is a government and military influence. They cannot. They have to face this. So outside Burma also very important. And also one of the key problem here is the freedom of the speech. So definition of the freedom of speech and the hate speech and also dangerous speech. So we need to define here what is the consequence of the freedom of course, as a human rights activist, I strongly support for the freedom of the speech. But at the same time, Burma, we need to understand the context and the situation in country, Burma, what's happening in Burma.
Okay,
so
got it.
That's a very important
totally
fine line here.
Okay, totally understood. Benjamin Ang, for those who might draw a historical parallel with, for example, Rwanda, and say, well, a lot of the calls for killings and calls for genocide happened over shortwave radio. Was radio more than just a tool? Should it have been shut down? Is Facebook just that equivalent? Is Facebook just radio? The radio of Rwanda, is that what Facebook is in Myanmar?
Facebook would love us to think that they're just a radio. But honestly, their talk about free speech is marketing speak. They don't have free speech on Facebook. There is no such thing because Facebook controls what we see. Facebook's idea of free speech is what will get more clicks and more advertising. So to depend on Facebook for free speech is futile. It's really, and they're a business. They're not a NGO on a crusade to save the world with free speech. They're out to make profit. So if any country's government says, look, if you don't follow what we are instructing you, we'll close you down, they'll comply. They are not our champions of free speech. They're a business. So we shouldn't be naive to think that they are going to be saving us from any oppression.
So, Hans, you were saying you don't want censorship on Facebook, or you don't want them to get involved in the issue of policing what's free speech and what's not and what's hate speech and so on. The other two gentlemen are saying it's already happening because Facebook has these deals country by country, and the government jumps in and says, I don't like that, shut it down. I don't like that. Can you shut it down? We've heard from Cho Win, who said that actually those who are complaining about incitement are getting their accounts cancelled because you have the government complaining about them. What do you make of that, Hans?
Well, look, no, I agree. I do not think Facebook should be shutting down speech because governments in Burma and elsewhere are telling them to do it. That's basically governments imposing censorship through a private company, and I'm certainly against that. And the process that was described of allowing complaints to be the measure of whether something should be shut down, that, of course, can lead to a lot of manipulation of people who are actually engaging in bad behavior using the complaint process to shut down others who are trying to stop them. What that says is that Facebook has a lot of work to do in trying to improve what it's doing and doing it in such a way that it is not engaging in censorship other than to stop, as I said, incitements to violence. It's one thing if you engage in speech that people don't like. It's quite another to say, well, you should go out and kill people who you don't like.
Right.
One is okay and should be acceptable even if we don't like it. The other is not.
What about a step before that? I just want to ask you ethically, I guess, as well, and maybe even legally, Hans. Just a step before the incitement to violence, you have a lot of fake stories that come out that say that the other side is doing terrible things. And this, while it might not be said on the Facebook platform itself, this is what inspires people to go out and butcher and massacre their neighbors. So they go onto Facebook and they read something that Hans and his people are preparing to kill us all.
Right.
That's what they read on Facebook. And then they go out and try to kill Hans before he kills them. What do you do with that?
Well, I understand that that's a problem, but I don't think the answer to that is setting up some ultimate authority who's going to decide whether the news is fake or not. The answer that we tend to give in the United States to speech that we think is wrong is more speech. And I think what you do when you the way to counter that is with more speech. And I would tell you, sometimes it's hard to judge whether something is fake news or not. You know, there are many media sources in the U.S. that do so-called fact-checking, and often the fact-checkers at different media sources disagree on whether something is true or not.
Now, that's true. Okay, so very finally, and I'm sorry because we are terribly out of time, Benjamin Ang, you're shaking your head in disagreement. Final response from you, sir.
Facebook is already doing this, and they are already controlling what is being seen. So, in a way, if we are thinking that they are ever going to do anything which will create some idea of fairness in the world, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen with
okay,
because it's a business.
Yeah, okay. It's been great talking to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers.
クとか2020年につながり、女性とかも同じような感じで。
Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, protests sweep across Armenia as the former president becomes prime minister. The opposition says it's trying to start a revolution against a power grab. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.